Hi guys, welcome to week 5. We are breaking down some ideas revolving around the first wave of feminism, again this week, focusing more specifically on Black suffragettes and how both movements kind of mirrored one another and sort of competed and contrasted as well. So we're going to talk about some different elements involving these two sort of separate groups. So last week we talked about a lot of different groups like the NWSA and the AWSA and kind of how all these groups competed. And I'm going to sort of give you a slight refresher just because a lot of it leads into the information and ideas we're focusing on today as well. So with last week, we kind of talked about some of these different elements and moments in history, such as the founding of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, which we're going to talk about again today, the 13th Amendment and the Civil War with the abolishment of slavery in 1865, the 15th Amendment, which is passed in 1870 and allows men to vote, Black men to vote specifically, and then 1920 with the 19th Amendment allowing women to vote. So what we have, however, as I stated last week, and I tried to make this sort of larger PowerPoint in which I was moving back and forth between the two movements, and it was going to be some ridiculous amount of hours. So I decided to sort of do this next week here, aka this week, so that we would be able to focus sort of on these two separate issues without it being too long. I feel like some of these lectures get really long. So this week we're looking at some really important Black suffragette figures. As Barbara Smith said in 1979, feminism is the political theory and practice that struggles to free all women. Anything less than this vision of total freedom is not feminism, but merely female self-aggrandizement. As we talked about with Estelle B. Friedman's text from No Turning Back, this second half of the reading, I believe in chapter 4, really sort of identifies and thinks about sort of the Black suffragettes versus the white suffragettes and kind of what happens with these two groups colliding, as they were very much anchored together in the 30s and 40s. So in the United States, in contrast, the colonized lived among the colonizers, in a nation that simultaneously championed freedom, exterminated Native people, and enslaved Africans. It is not surprising that issues of race would become so central to the women's movements. In each wave of the movement, women of color have insisted upon pivoting the center so that feminism addresses the needs of all women. The repeated process of naming difference, organizing separately, and building political coalitions has ultimately strengthened feminism in the United States by extending its critique of inequality to all women and recognizing its historical connection to all movements for social justice. I'm not sure if I totally agree with Friedman in this last paragraph. It seems to say that their diversity kind of brought them back together, and I think that that is in part true. But I think there is still a separation between these women and sort of what they want. And I'm not sure if they ever come to like a really solid agreement during this time and maybe even after. So especially until 1965, when we actually have the passing of the Civil Rights Acts. So we'll talk about that. But I'm not entirely sure I completely agree with this sort of I don't know, cookie cutter version of everyone coming back together again. So like I said, I'm going to mention and talk about the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, which we talked about last week. We also talked about Maria W. Stewart and her lectures and conversations in 1833. And of course, Sojourner Truth, as well. So we have all of these very famous figures, and we're going to dive a lot more into them this week and really sort of investigate who comes after the 30s and what kind of happens with this split in the 70s because of the 15th Amendment, and then how do we see the two groups interacting with one another. I do want to come up front and say that I'm not going to be using this term in the lectures. It's used a lot by women and men of the time, and I'm just not going to. So when you see the word in quotes, I'll probably just skip over it as best I can. And it's really a word that we stopped using in the 60s. And sort of black women, men became the preference in the 70s, but there has been some issue with that overall. And so there are conversations about what's sort of appropriate and how black individuals refer to themselves in before the 19th century, or sorry, before the 20th century, and then within the 20th century. But just so you know that you're aware, there's been there's been different debates about preferences and what Booker T. Washington has said and W.E.B. Du Bois, but I'm just going to sort of avoid that word entirely. So if you see me skip over it, that is all I'm doing, sort of for a comfortability measure for everyone as a whole. So as we talked about last week, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as well as Frederick Douglass and other figures working together to try to get the abolition of slavery, as well as getting everyone the right to vote. However, what we see is that there's sort of an early separation in some ways, especially between Southern women and kind of Northern women, and how they approach sort of racism and slavery and all of these sort of massive issues that are complicating sort of people's relationships in trying to get suffrage. And so Friedman talks about it in her book, Popular Beliefs in a Biological as well as a Theological Basis of Racial Hierarchy Justify Both Slavery and Colonialism. Scientists who investigated brain size and structure relegated both women and lower races such as Africans to the bottom rungs of the human hierarchy. For white feminists, race presented a particular vexing dilemma. Just as the principle of natural rights could exclude women on biological grounds of natural sex, the concept of natural race excluded Africans, Asians, and other non-Europeans as less fully human than Europeans. White feminists could claim race privilege by insisting that they were more intelligent and deserving of rights than other demeaned groups, but doing so both negated the idea of a common womanhood or reinforced the subordination of African, Asian, Native American, and Mexican women as well as men. Did the identity woman include all women, or only those who were entitled to rights based on their race? So what you see is a complication in that, should they be trying to include everyone, or do they see strength, do white women in particular, see strength in separating from the abolitionist groups to focus only on themselves, which is selfish in a lot of ways, but did they feel forced to do so based upon the racist climate of the time? So when we talked about these two groups splitting with the AWSA and the NWSA, clearly you had women on both sides sort of picking what side they thought would best fit women suffragettes at the time. And it's interesting because when the 15th Amendment is ratified and these two groups split, you start to have a lot of conversations occur about maybe the morality of figures like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But that's kind of a large part of some of the issues that come down to the separation between white and black suffragettes. So, as I stated last week, even though you have in the 70s the passing of the 15th Amendment, there are Jim Crow laws as well as the Ku Klux Klan preventing black men from continuing to vote anyway. And so although they've been voted suffrage or allowed suffrage, they're still continuing to not vote. And then once again, African American women struggled on several fronts for suffrage, to improve conditions for their race, and to achieve equality with white women, not for white women. So obviously, a lot of segregation is occurring in the 19th and 20th centuries, as well as segregation in schools. And then, of course, the Ku Klux Klan as well, preventing men from voting. A comment that I found interesting when I was sort of delving into this relationship and how people kind of perceive white abolitionists today, and do we find them to be sort of inherently racist and that they were unwilling to support black female suffragettes. And there were some interesting conversations about how, even though slavery is abolished in 65, 30 to 40% of slave owners were white women. There have been a lot of sort of studies that are coming out pointing out that a lot of women would take over roles from their husbands or in their own right. And so many of them owned slaves as well. And so when you have this abolition occurring, you still have women on both sides of the issue. Obviously, you still have women who were on the Confederate side believing that they should still have slavery and that Black individuals are below them. And so when you start to talk about kind of what Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton engaged in, you start to see how Black women felt very much separated from the white female group. So, for example, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had George Train, who was funding their newspaper, The Revolution, as part of the NWSA, and his motto for his campaigns were woman first, Black last. Obviously, there's that word again, like I said before. So you also had a lot of these very racist and white supremacist women becoming part of the NWSA and other groups because, of course, they wanted female suffrage, but did not want that for Black women. And so Belle Kearney was one of them. She became a speaker and lobbyist for the NAWSA, but was a white supremacist, and she hoped that women's suffrage would bring about immediate and durable white supremacy, honestly attained. Rebecca Latimer Felton, who was even worse than the previous figure. I believe she was part of the NAWSA as well and was a secretary. She was also the first female member of the Senate ever, I believe, of the Senate for a day, which is silly. But she stated, when there's not enough religion in the pulpit to organize a crusade against sin, nor justice in the courthouse to promptly punish crime, nor manhood enough in the nation to put a sheltered arm around innocent and virtue, if it needs lynching to protect women's dearest possession from the ravening human beasts, then I say lynch, and 1,000 times a week if necessary. And lynching is a big part of the conversations between suffragettes on both sides, because you're having Black men lynched constantly for all of these quote-unquote crimes that they're supposedly committing, particularly against sort of the virtue of white women, right? Oh, they're having sex with white women, they are raping them, etc. And so you have Ida B. Wells, who we're going to talk about shortly, who is the most amazing suffragette, as well as other figures talking about how much lynching is in complete negation with what white women are sort of supporting, right? If you believe in equality, you can't also believe in the lynching of Black men. So these suffragettes come out and sort of are these massive figures of anti-lynching, as well as getting women the right to vote generally. Continuing on with some of these other figures, Kate M. Gordon, who was a large part of the NAWSA, but left in 1909, realizing that Black women would also get the right to vote, and thus opposed the 19th Amendment. She had a motto of her group, which was called "Make the Southern States White," and that motto seems vaguely familiar right now, if you don't follow my drift. Other figures, unfortunately, included Anna Howard Shaw, which is probably the worst of all of these figures, who is right here. Maybe not. Lynching 1,000 times is pretty horrific. But here you have Shaw, and she's sitting next to Susan B. Anthony, who you see here. And Shaw takes over for Susan B. Anthony and is the leader of the NAWSA for 11 years. And she was extraordinarily racist. She says, you have to put the ballot in the hands of your Black men, thus making them political superiors of white women. Never before in the history of the world have men made former slaves the political masters of their former mistresses. She would also go on to say, in Germany, German men govern German women. In France, French men did the same. But in this country, American women are governed by every kind of man under the light of the sun, complained Anna Howard Shaw, successor to Anthony as NAWSA president. So as you can see, you have heads of these groups that are very opposed to suffrage to anybody but white women. And so you can imagine that Black suffragettes do not want and are not willing to necessarily work with these women. And it is lucky that the groups start to come together and that you have more tolerance. But because of these sort of Confederacy focused women, you have this splitting of the group that really shouldn't happen, but is very much a part of this late 1800s issue between these two groups. Luckily, Shaw does leave the NAWSA and gives it over to her friend, Kat, who we talked about last week. So she didn't really like the National Women Party's militant tactics by Alice Paul, and so she kind of gives it over and leaves the position, which is good, although Kat is not necessarily phenomenally better. I have been reading up a lot on this issue and sort of how do you sort of relegate your anger at sort of white women and the way that they were behaving in the 1800s to the 1900s? How do we sort of forgive them, even though they are incredibly racist? Or how do we condone this behavior, right? How can we sort of raise them up as symbols to getting women the right to vote while also bringing down the other half of the population? I read this article recently, and it talked a lot about women fearing for their lives as suffragettes, that although they are sort of fighting against these constructs of allowing Black women to vote as well, they're also having to deal with a lot of fear around just speaking publicly as a white woman in general. So, for example, I have some text from this article that I read. So, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes this article. I don't believe it's for The Atlantic, though, but I'll double check because I did put the link in the PowerPoint. But he talks about this issue between sort of the racist white suffragettes against the Black suffragettes. And he talked about rhetorical violence in newspapers and pamphlets fed mob violence. Women were not exempt. In 1835 in Boston, a crowd of several thousand threatened members of the ASS, Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, who were thought to be hiding a visiting British abolitionist in their meeting rooms. Afterward, Maria Weston Chapman, a leading member, could not walk in the streets of her own city without passerby and shop clerks hurling abuse at her. The Boston women noted acidly the double standard that divided acceptable female behavior from activity that as reviled. They were all involved in several reform causes. No one said then women had better stay home. Doing the same thing on the behalf of slaves, though, was another matter, bringing threats bordering on lethal. Sansel doesn't say this, but I have to believe that the prospect of rape often hung in the background. Nor were threats of sexism strictly the province of the foes of women abolitionists. Sarah Grimke, who credited abolition with helping awaken her to the persistent oppression of women, was denounced by her abolitionist allies for daring to publicly raise the cause of women's rights alongside abolition. After thugs in Philadelphia broke up the meeting of one of the anti-slavery societies, the Colored American, a Black newspaper, took the opportunity to warn Black women in the abolitionist movement away from the Grimkes, toward the work of health at home. So even as these women are trying to fight on both sides, they're being met with issues from both groups constantly, and threats to their lives and violence, and so and rape. And so how do we sort of relegate or continue to condone that behavior, right? You don't want to say that it's okay, because it clearly isn't. But there's this sort of massive issues that are a big part of it and the big part of why these things happen. And even figures like Susan B. Anthony are talked about being quote unquote racist figures because of their sort of anti-female, black female suffrage stances. Susan B. Anthony writes in 1866, "What arrogance to put the question, what shall we do with the race of men and women who have fed, clothed, and supported both themselves and their oppressors for centuries? The only way to solve the race question was to educate blacks to be the equal to their opportunities and for whites to be willing to share their privileges," which is a very incredibly non-racist statement. She very much supported early on the suffrage of black women, and what kind of ends up happening is because of this 1870 passing, she very much separates out. But how do we then deal with her as a figure? Susan B. Anthony saw white privilege embedded into our culture. What she could not foresee in 1866 was how white privilege, racism, and sexism would evolve and persevere, finding new ways to obscure oppression. At the time, Susan B. Anthony was almost universally reviled for her anti-racist views. White historians, to prove their anti-racist bona fides, have often ignored this fact by taking her quotes out of context. Other white historians have focused entirely on Susan B. Anthony's anti-slavery work and close relationships with black women, but ignored her willingness to work with racist suffragettes. It is as if she is a proxy for our own struggle with racism. Judging historical figures' actions as racist, assimilitionist, or anti-racist broadens our understanding of them and by extension ourselves. By thinking about race through this lens, we can self-assess questions like, do we push out of our comfort zone to call out racist behavior? Have we judged whiteness to be the only model worth emulating? Do we recognize our own unearned privilege? Do we sometimes build up historical figures only to tear them down to vote our own racist complicity? In considering these questions, we should self-examine by asking, if Susan B. Anthony was racist, does that mean I am too? And this was all outlined by the Susan B. Anthony Museum, the one that also denied Trump's pardon. But as we continue to think about these figures, we have to recognize their faults as well as who they were positively in society, and one doesn't go without the other, especially with figures like Susan B. Anthony and Cady Stanton and Kat. So, and even Alice Paul, who is this very famous figure, doesn't really even approach these issues at all because their minds are very sort of laser focused. And so in continuing to be educated and aware, we need to be sort of aware of these contradictions in who they are as people, and then use that to sort of question who we are as individuals as well. And many people believe that Susan B. Anthony kind of reconciled with some of these issues that she was kind of dealing with in connecting with racist suffragettes, because Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony did reconcile their relationship, and Douglass did speak highly of her, and apparently they have 1 million children books together. I don't know why. But I did learn that for some reason. They came back together and were very famous figures in abolition and the suffragette movement as well. And so there is the hope that some of these women sort of reconciled what they had done and were able to in some capacity sort of apologize for the situations that they had created in some capacity, or at least Susan B. Anthony did to some extent.